Hi, I'm Seth Truger, Digital Media Editor for JAMA Network Open. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of JAMA Network Open Live.
And I'm Mike Berkowitz. I'm Electronic Editor for JAMA and the JAMA Network, and we're back with JNO Live discussing three of the most exciting articles published in the latest release.
Great, thanks for tuning in. If you're watching live, please be sure to add your questions or comments on the Facebook thread below or respond to us on Twitter at JAMA Network Open.
What do you have, Seth?
All right, first I wanted to backtrack to last week's paper, the Gupta paper on adult allergies. We talked about a little bit. It got some news coverage, including on The Daily Show, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention and a lot of discussion both on Twitter and in the general news media.
Yeah, so just to recap, it was a paper by Gupta. They asked 40,000 adults what kind of food allergies they had. Interestingly, about 20% of adults in America think they have a food allergy. Based on their questions, they found that only half of those, about 10% of adults, actually had convincing food allergies, and that about half of those were classified as serious allergies.
Right, and this was a survey study, and these were all self-reports, but they had these stringent allergy criteria, which they thought would probably identify patients more likely to have physician-diagnosed allergies, although that wasn't validated in this particular study.
Right, and what would, to me, one of the big interesting takeaways that, from my quick searches, the previous data we have shows that it thought that about 5% or 1 in 20 American adults had food allergies. And in this data set, they found 10% of adults had convincing food allergies. Now, it's interesting, and there was a lot of commentary, including some, I think, potentially negative commentary on The Daily Show and some other news coverage. I don't mean to signal out The Daily Show. That's not...
It was just our highest profile coverage, and we love to see Trevor Noah talking about JAMA Network Open.
Yep, absolutely. Some of the coverage is like, oh, look at people who are silly for thinking they have allergies when they actually don't. And I think this actually gets really complicated because first of all, a lot of people just don't really know what an allergy is or what a reaction is or how something that they're feeling produces some sort of sensation or symptoms they have. It might be using allergy in some sort of non-specific sense. There's also lots of situations where people could have been told by a physician they have an allergy or an allergy-like reaction. For instance, when I have patients who have ACE inhibitor-associated angioedemas, I think the term is becoming popular now.
Okay.
Just tell them, what, this is an acne allergy, but it's just easier if you tell people it's an allergy so they don't prescribe this drug or they know about your reaction. There's just a whole lot of reasons why people might think or might respond in a survey that they have an allergy when they don't.
Right, and we talked about that a little bit last week, that even with the stringent criteria, some of these could be identifying people who had adverse reactions to food rather than true allergies. The true concerning food allergy is an IgE-mediated one. There's also T-cell moderated kinds of allergies. If you remember from your basic medical school days, there's 4 types of hypersensitivity. I don't remember exactly what they're...
5 types.
5? I thought there were
5.
4.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, if you know 4 or 5, please comment and let us, and you'll educate us, and we'll talk about it as a group. In any event, they're all immune-mediated, but a lot of bad reactions or symptomatic reactions is what I should say to food aren't necessarily allergy. But what Seth is saying is that we're actually probably putting too much fault on patients for misunderstanding reactions as allergy or not. It may not be all that important, particularly if it's a serious enough reaction that they're uncomfortable. It brings them into the physician, and then in a partnership with the clinician can figure out what's going on.
Right. Exactly. So moving on to the studies from this week.
Yes.
First up.
That's what I want to hear about.
Excellent. Good stuff. New science. Always fun. The first one is assessment of a simulated case-based measurement of physician diagnostic performance by Chatterjee and colleagues.
Physician diagnostic performance. So Seth, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that this is about evaluating and teaching physicians how to actually make the diagnosis on patients in a simulated way, right?
Right. Yep. So what these authors did was look at the Human DX app, which is basically a case-based medical app that you can use on smartphones, tablets, computers, etc. And there are these morning grand round cases that you can go through. You get different information. You can select how much information you get at a time. It's shown in Figure 1, kind of an example case. You get the titles, the basic HPI, physical exam findings. You can get lab results, and I think you kind of moderate how much information you get at a time.
Right.
And then you get to add your potential diagnoses to a differential and then select what you think your final answer is.
Right. I think it's kind of like a virtual patient, sometimes with kind of supporting images and so on, but it's text-based. But it releases information in incremental ways that kind of mimics or is supposed to mimic a little bit more of the clinical encounter.
Right. This actually seemed kind of similar to me, like a trimmed down version of the step 2 case or step 3 cases for the USMLE, where you go through the computer and there's a whole bunch of different cases and you just ask for information and get it back.
Right, and I don't know if you know this, Seth, but Human DX, I think, was a candidate. I think the MacArthur Foundation was putting out these $1 million or $1 billion awards. I forget the dollar amount, but it was kind of one of the runner-ups because the idea for Human DX, well beyond this paper, is that it allows a kind of a virtual resource, a consultation resource for making diagnosis for physicians globally who need help with their patients who may be isolated, not parts of systems, and so on. So that value remains to be proven, but the idea is a good one, and I think this group is trying to get Human DX into a position where it's actually more of a resource for physicians.
Right, and what they were trying to do in this study was try to kind of get some face validity of are these actually accurate in assessing kind of the skill of the practitioners involved. So they looked at, I think it was, let me find the numbers, it's kind of impressive, 11,000 case solves based on 1,700 different individual solvers of different levels of education across 170 different cases.
That's a huge sample of physicians, clinicians trying to solve cases.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. That's just a lot of people solving little morning cases every day.
Right.
They had about 240 attending docs, 900 and so residents, 350 interns, and 200 or so medical students solving cases. And what they found when they looked at 2 different measures, one was the accuracy of how good the docs, or the providers were at figuring out the case, and 2 was the efficiency, was how much information they needed to ask for in order to solve the case. And they found, not terribly surprising, that the more senior docs did a better job on both measures of that.
Better job meaning they were both more efficient and more accurate. They got to the right diagnosis quicker without asking for as much information, and they got the right diagnosis more often.
Exactly. So the attendings did the best. The residents were just as accurate as the attendings, but did require some more information overall. And then there's kind of linear kind of step down to interns and medical students.
Right. So my understanding of those findings, Seth, is that not necessarily they're so surprising. As you've noted, we expect more experienced clinicians to have a wider range of priors, more exposure to unusual cases, and be able to put that information together. But this is kind of a first step towards validating a measure, and maybe an educational measure for medical students and trainees to evaluate their diagnostic abilities, which is kind of intriguing, right?
Absolutely.
Kind of the science of education is in this in a very early form.
Right. I could also see something spinning out from this many iterations from now of replacing some sort of, say, mock or board testing or things like that, or supplementing it instead of a lot of the kind of simple multiple choice stuff we have a lot of tests on now.
Right. I was thinking that you mentioned USMLE, but it might be interesting to use these to kind of psychometrically test these within ABIM board certification or MOC or any other board certification tests, and see whether performance on this can be used to predict certification outcomes. Certification is incredibly controversial. People don't want to be sitting for exams anymore.
And it's expensive.
But that form is probably still going to be available for testees, at least for the foreseeable future. And so that might be a way to plug this in, not only to undergraduate medical education and postgrad medical education, but continuing maintenance of certification, which could be a nightmare or not. But if we don't know how the measures perform, we can't do it. So this kind of begins to establish these measures as something that might be worth using or looking into.
Yeah, and I would say I would certainly much rather do a couple cases a couple times a week than have to sit for a big high-stakes multi-hour test or multi-day test once every 5 or 10 years.
Right. And then to kind of flip it back to the point that I was making, if you are kind of alone with patients and you can't figure out the diagnosis, this platform is really a resource for you to post information about the patient you have and kind of have some crowdsourcing of the diagnosis. I don't know how accurate it is in that respect, whether you want to rely on the global community to solve your patient case in front of you, but it allows you to get some input.
Because the accuracy rates were pretty good, but the accuracy scores were, I want to say, in the 80s for the attending docs. So even for these written artificial cases, people weren't, the most senior docs weren't completely perfect on these.
And my comments are taking kind of a global emphasis. Do we know where these people are located?
They only looked at U.S. providers.
So this is U.S. based.
Yep, this is all U.S. based. And also, I should say, these were kind of generalist cases. They looked at internal medicine, family medicine, and emergency medicine. And I'm curious as to why or why not, but they didn't compare specialties, which I would be a little interested in, whether they wanted to be polite or didn't find anything interesting or didn't think about it or I don't know.
Right. Well, you don't necessarily expect an interventional cardiologist to be able to diagnose infectious mononucleosis.
Right.
One would hope that they could pick up on that, but maybe not.
Right, exactly.
Okay, well, that's a great paper to start with. What do you have next?
Right, so next up we've got machine learning-based prediction of clinical outcomes for children during emergency department triage by Goto and colleagues.
So I think I saw this in the Terminator movie series. The machines are coming, right?
Yep.
And they're going to take over.
Yep, they're going to take our jobs. First
Yes,
they're going to read
okay.
x-rays for us, and then they're going to totally triage all the kids.
Yeah, don't forget the pathology slots, right? Okay.
Right, that actually might be pretty convenient for me.
So this is artificial intelligence in peds emergency rooms, and some of my best friends are pediatric emergency medicine physicians. So tell me what I need to know.
Right. So what these authors did was they used NAMC's data, or HAMC's, depending on who you ask. These are the National Hospital Ambulatory Medical Care Survey from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics, which is a big database from the ED data set. Looks at a just ton of data that's extracted from a big sample of emergency departments nationwide. We looked at I think it was 9 years, 2007 to 2015 or so.
Right.
And it's 50,000 or so kids visits, and basically use machine learning to try to see if the easily obtainable information, the kind of hard objective data like vital signs, did you come by an ambulance or walk in or car, if machine learning could be used to kind of predict which kids would need to be either critical care admission or hospital admission at all.
So that sounds like really intriguing, but just to be clear, and you can tell me if I misunderstood, this is a retrospective look. They're looking at old data and they're seeing where these kids were admitted to, whether it was intensive care or floor, or whether they were admitted or not. So I'm going to have a follow-up question on that, because it's not taking future cases and training these AI algorithms to help physicians make the triage decision.
Yep. So as with a lot of kind of derivation and validation studies, they just kind of took one big data set and randomly split it in two parts. So 70% were used in the derivation to kind of figure out these 3 or 4 different algorithms they did, and then it was tested on the remaining 30%.
Right. So sometimes that's called split sample or development and validation cohorts and so on.
Yep.
Okay.
So what they found was it was kind of incrementally more accurate to use the machine learning than to use just the emergency severity index, which is the basic 5-point triage score that most emergency departments use to some degree or another, and found that it was like kind of accurate and a little bit more accurate. If you look at figure 1, there's an ROC curve, a receiver operator characteristic curve, which is just fun to say.
Right.
And the dark line in the center, kind of at the bottom, is just the ESI and how that worked, what they call the reference model. And then the squiggly lines above that are the machine learning doing a little bit better.
A little bit better. Okay.
A little bit better. Not a ton better, but a little bit better.
Okay. At predicting these things. So anything else we need to know? Because I have lots of questions.
That's the main data. I think what was, to me, one of the big takeaways was that the triage nurses, basically the nurses who were picking the ESI levels, were 91% specific for critical care outcome. So basically a triage nurse could say 90% of the time that if you're okay and you don't need to go to the ICU, they're going to pick you. They're going to pick that you're going to do okay and not need to go to the ICU or be surprised. This kind of resonates with a lot of what we know. With a lot of what we know. There's a great editorial a couple years ago by Steve Green, I think, in Annals of Emergency Medicine, called "Sick Kids Look Sick," which one of the things that's nice is, most of the time, it's fortunately with vaccines, with a lot of the care we're getting with kids, all sorts of reasons, there just aren't that many sick kids anymore, which they also found in their data set. There were only, I think, 160 or so kids who needed to go to the ICU. And we're pretty good at identifying who's not sick. We're less good at identifying who is sick. The sensitivity for the ICU outcome was only 54%. But again, this is just based on ESI, just based on the triage nurse picking one thing on a level 1 to 5 before you got seen by a doctor or any other real information.
So what does it mean, though? Or did you just tell me what it meant? Because the issue that I have with this paper, the things I couldn't quite get my arms around was, these are human decisions. So it's predicting a patient that's going to go to the critical care unit or to the floor, when that's a human decision that's based on a lot of kind of considerations. So it doesn't seem like as useful a prediction as if they were taking a bunch of these kind of physiologic and vital sign variables and saying, you better be thinking about sepsis in this kid, which is something you may not have thought of, and get blood cultures and then maybe admit for OBS until they're clear or something like that. So just admitting, just predicting an admission seems like it's not doing, it may or may not be adding that much value to the decisions that doctors are making already.
Yep, I totally agree. I think that was one of my big takeaways. This reminded me a lot of the test for individual physical exam characteristics. Where like, oh, if a patient has Robsing's sign, it's 80% sensitive, or 30% sensitive, and 80% specific. But that's not how any of us work, right? That's not how you work as a clinician. We sort this millions of points of information. We get all this different data and process it in all different ways. We don't go up to somebody and do a Thompson test and say, oh, you're fine, go home. There's one tiny pixel in a big.
Right.
Much bigger picture.
Right. And I know things are much more strict now. You can tell me how things work at Northwestern, but there were a lot of times when we would admit patients because they had unstable home situations. You wouldn't know whether they could make it back the next day for testing. So you admit not based on the physiologic lab exam information, but based on the consideration of where the patient is in his or her life and what they can manage, right?
Yep, absolutely. We take care of the whole patient, the whole situation, how things are going to do, how, same kind of thing with things like antibiotics. Is a patient going to be able to go to the pharmacy? Are they going to be able to fill the prescription? Are they going to be able to take pills however many times a day? Are they going to be able to recognize, when they're vomiting too much and they're not keeping the pills down, or when they're getting sicker, or be able to get to their follow-up visit?
Right. The other question I had is that if I admit a kid to the floor and then that kid is transferred to the ICU, is that a failure? Is that something that these models are recognizing? Is that anything we can tell from this paper?
I didn't see that in this paper. I might have missed it, to be honest with you. But you actually hit on a nerve for me, and this wasn't pre-planned. But I think that we oftentimes, hospital systems look at, people who get upgraded to critical care from a floor or other setting once they're in the hospital, and it's oftentimes implicitly described as kind of, a failure of the system. Right. I don't really think it's the system working. It's, if we admit someone to the hospital, part of the reason is because we're worried they're going to get sick. And they're around doctors and nurses who can take care of them and recognize when they're getting worse and escalate care if they need it.
So I guess there's Monday morning quarterbacking that starts in the ED, and so you get some of that. Kind of a methodological point here is that this is full of positive predictive, negative predictive values, and measures of discrimination, C statistics, and ROC curves, and those aren't necessarily clinically accurate. There are reclassification analyses that show what a new test adds, how many patients are reclassified into one risk category or outcome category when you add a new test to an existing one. And I would have liked to have seen that to know what AI is contributing to human judgment, which isn't to say that the doctors are good all the time. We all make mistakes. But this paper didn't tell me whether it's time to roll the machines in and get the docs out.
Yep, and I think that's an excellent point. As you can see, that the additional area under the curve in Figure 1, just on the ROC curve, is just not that much overall. There's also a great point made in the accompanying invited commentary that with the prevalence of critical care so low in this population, only 160 out of 52,000 kids, that you're going to have great negative predictive values, and it's going to be really hard to get really good positive predictive values, which is pretty much what they found.
Good to know. And I guess the final bottom line is what you said at the beginning is talk to your nurses. They are the best colleagues on the planet, and they know these kids. They know the patients. They know the systems, and almost to a person, they're the greatest physician resource.
Yep. One of the biggest paradoxes: the best nurses get shoved in, taken out of the ER and put in triage, where they're incredibly valuable, but then I lose that great bedside nurse for my selfish reasons.
Or they rise into administration. So,
or they get punished by being made charge nurse.
Right. The Peter principle, isn't that you rise you rise to your level of incompetency or something?
No.
Like
It's really important to have really good nurses in triage settings, of course, so they can outperform the machine, so we can all keep our jobs, and they can take jobs from the radiologists and pathologists.
Right. We salute you. Okay,
great.
What's next?
All right. Last up today, we've got trends in opioid prescribing and dispensing by veterinarians in Pennsylvania by Clark and colleagues.
Veterinarians, are those doctors who take care of animals?
Yes, these are not veterans, which we see a lot of studies on. I think there's 2 or 3 different coming up next week.
Right.
And this is opioids, which we do see a lot of data on coming out. But this is by veterinarians. This is from the.
I do want to say that when I worked I staffed the emergency room and urgent care for a number of years at the VA hospital, and about once a month we got calls about large animals because they called the vet's hospital, right? And they thought they were in the right place. We needed to refer them down the street.
When I was a resident, one of my co-residents took care of a dog who was brought in.
Right. Yeah. You needed to stabilize the dog before transferring.
Exactly.
Okay.
Even though EMTALA doesn't apply, we're still people. We can, that's a floor, not a ceiling of our standard of care.
Okay. So tell me what this was about, and why is JAMA Network Open publishing a veterinary medicine study?
So it's interesting because opioid prescribing is a real problem, or at least a part of the whole opioid epidemic. A lot of people are having issues with opioids. It's a major cause of death, especially in young people in America. And what they found is that, not terribly surprisingly, from 2007 to 2017, the rates of opioid prescribing by veterinarians actually went up a lot. And it's really interesting. And is it just that it's the same kind of culture of what's going on with human medicine, that we're just more used to opioids, we're prescribing opioids, the people who bring in their pets are asking for opioids because that's what they expect? Or is there also potential for downstream side effects, things like diversion to people taking their dog's codeine?
Right. The issue isn't really about side effects in the animals. It's really about whether humans can get access to opioids and either initiate an opioid use disorder or divert, and whether it's contributing at all to the epidemic that's in the country. And these data, which come from a single veterinary hospital, I assume in the Philadelphia area.
Yeah, it was Penn. It was Penn's Vet Hospital.
Okay, I wasn't clear on that. That's what I thought. Shows that it's something we need to think about. Yeah. And I think that the implication is, I think Pennsylvania State, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, has a prescription monitoring data program that plugs in all prescriptions to a central database so that a physician in Wilkes-Barre can see whether someone in Scranton or in Pittsburgh prescribed drugs for the same patient, and that if we plug veterinary systems in too, it might help humans, which is an interesting public health thing. Now, one of the other things that's interesting, like I was a little shocked that dogs and animals, I think this is dogs, cats, birds, and reptiles.
Yep. So, it was dogs and cats. It's what vets call small animals.
Yes.
They basically call dogs, cats, and then I think exotic animals, so rabbits, birds, reptiles.
Right. So I can't imagine an iguana getting a dose of tramadol.
I certainly can.
Because they behave like they're on tramadol even when they're clean, right? They're just sitting there basking in the sun. Right. But in any event, I think a lot of these are for antitussive properties, right? It's codeine. You remember Robitussin, I forgot what is it CD with the codeine in it. Anyways, these opioids, we've kind of lost sight of that, but docs used to use opioids as an antitussive, as a cough medicine. There's evidence that it works symptomatically. There's not evidence that it actually helps in any long-term resolution of any underlying illness. But that was interesting to me that vets, at least at Penn, are putting these out to dogs for a cough. I don't know why they would do that, but
they did. The authors did note that some of the data, I think it was the national data they incorporated in here, the codeine was actually going down a bit because apparently there's some data that it doesn't help dogs, but it's unclear whether it helps cats.
Is that right?
Which is interesting to me.
Okay.
I mean, I've certainly seen in my career there's still a ton of variability on codeine prescribing for cough. Personally or professionally, I don't prescribe codeine for cough just because we know opioids cause a lot of bad stuff.
Right.
And the therapeutic window for codeine is pretty narrow, if not negative.
Right.
And you need to get pretty high doses to get the antitussive property in adults. I don't know about cats.
Right. Right.
So.
And we're both adult docs, and I think the other thing that's
worth...
a
little bit.
Do you?
I do, yeah.
Okay, because I thought they all go to your neighboring hospital.
Yeah, but I work at our community affiliate a bit. And
Got it.
And, emergency docs are all qualified to see everybody. We're not just adult docs.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I don't think about as an adult physician is that having these meds they're available to toddlers who all they want to do is open up bottles and get into pills. I shouldn't say all they want to do. They want to do lots of other things too. But it's a temptation and it's a risk. So having lots of families have dogs and young kids, so that's a bit of an issue.
Right, and one of the issues, and the authors point this out, is fentanyl patches. We know only a small amount actually gets transmitted from the patch into the patient, and a lot of it, I think it's 90-something%, stays in the patch. So little kids love putting stuff in their mouth, whether they want to or not, and that's a pretty big dose of fentanyl you can get.
Yeah, I used to remember when I was a kid, I used to put on Band-Aids because I thought it was kind of cool and they smelled nice. And so can you imagine a little kid putting a sticker on their arm that's actually fentanyl? That would be awful.
Yeah, it's terrible. My daughter she always wants Band-Aids for her stuff. She's got this great placebo effect going. It's
exactly.
Nice, but like she'll sit there, she's like, and she comes down from crying, she's a little bit like, I need a Band-Aid.
Right, particularly with a drawing.
right. Yeah, sometimes she gets the Star Wars one, so it's okay.
So just as a final thought, I was initially shocked that Penn deemed that it didn't meet criteria for human subjects research.
Yeah.
But then I got over it because it's really only animals. And there is, for those of you,
I highlighted the same sentence.
so that's a really, it's unusual for our audience. But there are standards of research for animals. And if you go to veteditors.org, there's actually a whole guidance to veterinary editors of animal science journals with some ethical procedures and standards for animal research.
Yep. But it also does make sense. I mean, it's ultimately not the animals deciding whether or not, to ask for a prescription. It's the, it's the animal's owners, or it's the doctors, the vets who are prescribing this. So there are humans involved in this. It's not totally absurd for an IRB to be involved in some way.
No, I understand. And then the other thing, of course, that I had to think about, which I don't think this research can answer, is the baseline or background opioid use behaviors or standards of the pet owners, right? One can easily imagine, it's purely speculative, that if I had a dog and a habit, I might go to the veterinarian and say, I need this for my dog when I really need it for me, or I need to sell it in order to pay the rent.
Yep, exactly. One ray of light I did see in this paper, which has a lot of dark undertones, is that tramadol prescribing has dropped a bunch, basically from 2014, and as I'm not a fan of tramadol at all, so to see that prescribing go down is great, because tramadol is just not a very good drug.
I didn't think so, and I wasn't sure that it was an opioid. It's kind of hovered in this nebulous region of it's kind of opioid-like, but I didn't think it was as dependence-inducing.
Yeah, I think that...
What do you know about that?
The short answer, I think, is if you ask 10 doctors whether or not tramadol is an opioid, you'll probably get 15 different answers.
Okay.
But overall, I've had enough smart toxicologists tell me that it's an opioid enough, and we see enough addiction problems.
You do, okay.
That it's probably worth considering just a less powerful opioid that has a ton of side effects.
Good to know. Okay. Yeah. Well, hopefully we both learned something, and hopefully you guys have learned something from this conversation. Feel free to send comments even after we're off the air. This video will sit on Twitter and Facebook indefinitely for you to follow us and kind of just really dive into every word of what we've said.
Right, absolutely. So thanks for joining. Again, please be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn at JAMA Network Open. And we should be back next week, 2 o'clock on Monday.
2 o'clock on Monday, and be
Central.
sure to go to JAMANetworkOpen.com at 10 a.m. Friday Central Time, United States, for the latest releases that are coming out, and you can spend the weekend reading the papers so you can join us in discussion next week.
And of course, these papers and the rest are all already, from this week's release, are all posted at JAMANetworkOpen.com for free. Download. This is all open access.
All open access, free, and unrestricted rights for you to do with the information what you want. Great. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Take care.
Great. Thanks. See you next week.